Esfina, a little pink-haired girl who stands awkwardly in front of the guy who called her to talk, holding a bouquet of pink roses, the color of the girl's hair. He confessed his love for Esther and asked her to marry him in the future. But the calm Esfina was shocked, because she knew that in the future, this could not happen. And it frightened her that the man who proposed to her and confessed his love was this guy. He looked confused but confidently into her eyes and assured Esfina that he liked her very much. But despite these words, the girl resolutely turned away, explaining to the boy that she did not want to marry him. But the boy did not understand this. He tearfully explained to Esfina that he did not need anyone but her. Looking at this handsome, sweet boy in front of Esther, she knew that in the future he would become the strongest man in the empire, and people would call him the Devil Master of the Sword. He would also become the man that Esther would hate more than anything else in the world. Despite his insistence, Esfina rejected the boy's proposal and his declaration of love and pushed him away from her and began to run away. Even then, she realized that she should not have helped the boy who would become her sworn enemy in the future. Under the boy's gaze, she ran away, trying to get away from him as fast as possible. But suddenly, there was a huge explosion behind her, right where the boy was. Esfina ran away even more frightened, realizing that she had to leave the city as soon as possible to avoid dying at the hands of this madman. But while Esfina was running away and the dark-haired boy was chasing her, another boy flew in to help her, seeing that Esfina was in danger. But despite his benevolence, Esfina knew that this boy was the second person she should be wary of. But the blonde-haired boy smiled happily and promised to help Esfina on the condition that she chose him as her husband. As a result, Esfina was now being chased by a boy who would become the strongest in the empire, and in the future he would become the youngest leader of the knightly order. And in the future, the great magician. Esfina herself was a time traveler who had met these two boys quite by chance. The Celestial Knight Order is the Empire's most powerful force. Only talented knights and wizards can join. Each candidate is carefully evaluated by assessing their accomplishments. Age, gender, status, and fortune are irrelevant. All that matters is the candidate's ability. The Order is a place where almost every citizen of the Empire wants to join. Once there, a person automatically becomes an object of envy and honor. The 10 chosen candidates are called Royal Knights. Currently, the head of the Order of Knights is a man who is dubbed the strongest man in the Empire, Senok Ivan Black Knight. He is one of the 3 dukes of the Empire, as well as the youngest commander-in-chief. The protagonist, in turn, was the vice commander of the Celestial Knight Order. People disrespected her and discussed behind her back how terrible the girl was. Despite her abilities, the scar on her face was also very visible and was constantly discussed. Because Esfina was an orphan, she was not perceived as someone who was higher in rank than the other knights. And also the people around her hated her, so Esfina was never able to fully realize her abilities while she was in the shadow of her commander. So she considered herself a failure, and for that reason she hated Senok to death. One day the girl came in throwing papers on the table. She was trying to find out why she had been replaced by another person. After all, she was supposed to be the front-row leader at the ceremony. The man only awkwardly explained to the girl that he had not been given the reasons for such a change. But the change had been approved. Esfina was not happy after all. She had competed for the leading role at the ceremony and won, but the man didn't understand how she could ever hope for anything with her face. Then the girl knew her failure again. It was explained to her that Commander Senok would be the best fit for her role, because at least he didn't have the scar, which couldn't be hidden even by magic. Esfina tried to explain that she would wear a mask to hide her scar, but the man stopped her. He believed that their task was to preserve the dignity of the royal family, and Esfina was not suited for that task, especially since the decision had already been approved. So Esther decided to speak to the commander-in-chief herself. The girl never really wanted to hate him, but she found that everyone around her was doing everything to make her feel hate. As soon as Esfina left the office of the commander-in-chief, she saw a knight who laughed at the girl for losing her place despite winning the competition. This guy was Davin Cher, the 6th place Heavenly Knight of the Order. As he walked away, he explained to Esfina that this place was more suitable for Senoku, and it was the best decision for everyone. Then Esther remembered her life. As a small child, she had lost everything in a fire. Her loved ones, her home, all her belongings. The culprit who set the fire was never caught. Soon after, the girl discovered she had amazing sword skills. And perhaps if she had been recognized then, people would have treated her differently. But even though Esfina had talent and excelled over many knights, she was unable to achieve more because of one man, Sanoka, who was the most impregnable wall of all the royal knights. She hated him, and if she had the opportunity to never meet him, she would definitely take it. The guy's perfection always made Esther despair, and she didn't want to go through life feeling inadequate. Of course, there was a story that anyone could become a heavenly knight because of their abilities. But the aristocrats were gaining more and more power each time, so the order was no longer as great as it once was. And Esther realized it was time for her to leave. But the problem was, Esther had no family, no home, and lately she was wondering about the meaning of her life. But before she died, Esfina wanted to defeat the commander for once, so she challenged him to a fight, which was her last request. She convinced him that she was serious about her intentions, although she was embarrassed that the guy was talking to her so close to her. He finally agreed, much to the girl's relief, and then she walked away. And looking at her, Sanok realized what a mess this girl's mind was in right now. It was already raining when they arrived at the practice field. Sanok offered to reschedule their bout for another day. He didn't want Esfina to be upset if she lost because of the weather. She ignored the words and thanked him for his punctuality, and explained that everything was fine. But she still clarified that she wasn't the kind of person for whom rain was a problem. As they began their duel, Sanok went on the attack, and Esfina dodged his lunges. Her strategy was to focus on Sanok's arm movements to get out of the way. As she got closer and her sword was near the young man's neck, she thought she had won. But all of a sudden, Sanok delivered a slashing blow to her shoulder, so Esfina had to retreat. Sanok recommended that Estefina admit defeat. Esfina was upset that she was so close to winning, but she still lost. Today was her last chance, and she even came up with a strategy to defeat the commander. Suddenly, the girl remembered what she admired so much about this young man. He had always been punctual, responsible, and strong, something Esther respected. But she began to realize that she had developed an inferiority complex because so many people hated her for the fact that she existed. That was absolutely not Sanok's fault and never had been. Esther realized that she would never pick up a sword again, so this was her last battle. She knew that Sanok's first attack was always the horizontal section, but Sanok saw that the girl's gaze was always focused on his arm. She kept swinging at him with all her might. And finally, when she got to sunset and the sun was blinding the boy, he couldn't react in time to Esfina's attack when she used her sword magic. As he fell to his knees, Sanok realized that Esfina had chosen this time for a reason. It was 5 p.m., and that was her plan from the beginning. As the girl tried to catch her breath after the fight, she was glad that the weather had not affected the outcome of the battle. Esfina had fought 100 duels and had 99 defeats, but one victory that she treasured. On her way home, Esfina didn't want to treat her wounds, because no one would be waiting for her at home anyway, even if she died. But suddenly on the road, she noticed a small, fluffy rabbit. Without seeing it, a carriage was about to run over the creature. Esfina realized that she didn't have time to save it, but she still didn't want to leave this poor rabbit in trouble. So at the last moment, she grabbed it, covering it with her own body, from the carriage. The coachman getting off his horse saw that the girl was dead, but being frightened, decided to ride away in order to escape. Esfina was too weak after her fight with Sanok to do anything about it. She died alone, but she wasn't upset about it, for she had ended her career in the Celestial Knight Order with her victory, and that was enough. However, she felt that her life was too short. Then she did not even think that she would be granted another life, and she would meet again the man she hated with all her soul, but already in the form of a child. Lying on the grass, the protagonist did not yet realize that she was in another body, and thought only about how her body hurt. She remembered being hit by a carriage, but suddenly opening her eyes, she didn't realize where she was. The view was amazing, and the girl still thought she was dead and in paradise. Her throat was also dry, and she decided to drink some water. But when she went to the water to drink some, she saw her reflection. It took Esfina a few minutes to realize the reality, and then she started screaming in fright because her face and body had changed, and she had become a child. What upset her the most was that her trained, gorgeous body, which was the knight's domain, was gone. And now her body was much weaker than her old one, so the girl was only tired from screaming too much. But the rabbit who suddenly appeared in front of her was glad that Esfina had finally come to her senses. The rabbit then introduced himself, explaining that he was the deity of fate to whom Esfina should be grateful for her rescue. That's when she remembered that it was the same rabbit she had rescued from under the carriage. At that moment, the girl had taken him for an ordinary animal. But now she saw that it didn't look like a rabbit at all. Then, Esfina decided to clarify the event and asked who had turned her into a child. As it turned out, it was also the fault of this deity. But Esfina was not grateful to him. She demanded an explanation as to why he had done such a thing to her body. The joyful rabbit calmly explained to the girl that she had died after the event on the road. He had saved her by giving her a new body. This realization made Esfina cry, even though she had previously thought her life didn't matter. The rabbit explained that she died not because Esfina had saved him, but because she was destined to die that day. And even if she hadn't noticed him, death would have caught up with her in another way. But he liked the girl, so he decided to give her a new body. However, the body was temporary and would soon disappear once the effects of its power were over. And the rabbit wondered if the girl wanted to continue living on. Esfina realized that she was wrong to die, and from now on she wanted to live her life happily, without regrets. So the rabbit suggested to Esther that she make a pact, because the girl's current body was now under the control of a deity of another level. But one day, a crack between dimensions caused some divine creatures to escape. But if Esfina agreed to help the rabbit to find all the creatures that had left the time zone, he would allow her to live on. Seeing Esfina's lack of understanding, he decided to explain the details and revealed that they were now 18 years before Esfina's death. And it turns out they'd gone back in time. The rabbit did this for the girl because he liked her. Specifically, he was fascinated by her determination to help someone. But the deity decided to discuss the rest of the details on the way to the nearest village, because there was no point in staying in this place. Despite her acceptance, Esfina still couldn't accept the fact that she had traveled back 18 years. She wanted the rabbit to give her a more mature body, but he didn't have the power to do that, so Esfina had to accept her new fate. So they walked quietly until Esfina heard some strange sound, like someone crying. And as she searched the forest for the child, she finally found the boy. She didn't understand what he was doing here at such a late hour, though she noticed that the boy was very handsome and would definitely become a real beauty in the future. But the color of his eyes didn't appeal to Esther, because those eyes were exactly like the commander's. Although Estefina was sure that even as a child, Sanok was not such a fearful boy. He was probably just as calm and indifferent, so this child had nothing to do with Sanok, she thought. But she was concerned about why the boy was shaking so much and crying. But when she asked Esfina if she was a member of the gang, she didn't even know what he was talking about. But suddenly the boy cried even harder, and a frightened Esther begged him to calm down. She had a weakness for baby crying from her past life. She asked the rabbit to do something, but he was invisible to the children. Then Esfina explained to the child that children should not be in the forest at a time like this, for it was very dangerous. But the boy explained to Esfina that she was also a child. But he told her that a gang led by Pantheon was bothering him, and told that Pantheon was their teacher's favorite student. It was because of his privileges that the boy bullied him, because he was good with a sword. And despite his actions, he was appreciated. And after all the bullying, the guys always left him here in the forest. Esfina began to ask the boy about his studies. As it turned out, despite his best efforts, he couldn't handle a sword at all. Looking at his wounds, Esfina realized that it was the result of violence, and that the Order had something similar. There were knights who chose only objectively weak partners as opponents, but of course Esfina did not let them go unpunished. This attitude toward evil was also why she was hated. So she explained to this kid that no matter what the circumstances, it wasn't his fault he was getting beaten up, because those kids were the ones with the obvious problems. And she suggested that next time he should definitely get back at them. The boy tried to explain that this was not the right thing to do, but embarrassedly thanked the girl for her comfort and words. Smiling happily, the main character praised him for his determination and asked him what his name was. But just as he was about to answer, Esfina immediately heard the shout of the approaching boys who were looking for this child. He immediately sat down on the ground and covered his ears with his hands. Hearing the scream, the rabbit realized that very soon there would be a fight in this place, though for some reason he was happy about it. Esfina explained to the rabbit that there was no reason to be happy, because she would not be able to protect a boy with such a weak body. She had only recently regained consciousness, and could still fall. But the rabbit explained that her condition would soon change, because the girl was not yet fully accustomed to her new body. The rabbit explained that her condition would change soon, because the girl was still getting used to her new body. But the treatment had to be special, and the master had agreed to it. After finding the nearest stick, Esfina asked why the three of them were attacking one child. That's when the boy noticed a girl he hadn't noticed before. But standing up for Sinok, Esfina offered them a one-on-one battle. Esfina rebuked the boys for wanting to be knights so badly, but the three of them attacking one defenseless man, and explained that it wasn't a battle, it was violence. But when the boys wouldn't budge, she just smiled mockingly, realizing that they were the kind of idiots who couldn't defeat the enemy by fighting alone. Pantheon was infuriated by such a thing and lunged at the girl, shouting profane name-calling. Esfina was surprised that the child already knew such bad words. Then she jumped up and struck a blow of immense force, so much so that there was a surge of energy all around. And when it all dissipated, Pantheon and Esfina were separated by a huge crater. At the same time, having frightened her opponent enough, Esfina explained to Pantheon that he was a real brute, and the humiliated guy immediately made his friends go into battle with the girl. But she could easily win the fight, even though she was wielding an ordinary stick. Although two guys she did not hurt, because her goal was originally the Pantheon, on which she pointed her improvised sword. He thought that such an act can be called meanness, because Esfina had other opponents, but she smiled calmly and threw the stick away. Then crying, Ponton threatened the girl that he would take revenge on her, but she was not surprised by such threats, for she already knew what fate awaited such a man. But what bothered her more was the strangeness of her body. Esfina had never studied swordsmanship, but her body moved very naturally, and there was a lot of power in her body. The rabbit only smiled happily, reminding him that Esfina had recently asked for a different body, but he had chosen the best one for her. Esfina suddenly remembered that she was protecting the boy, so she quickly ran up to him. She held out her hand to him and began to look over Sanok, hoping he wasn't hurt anywhere. The embarrassed boy then thanked Esfina for his rescue and thought she was insanely cool, because it was the first time he had ever seen the Pantheon run away from someone in fear, especially since none of the boys had ever managed to beat him up. But Esfina, at the moment of her victory, was so beautiful and cool that it was impossible to look away from her. But during their conversation, Esfina's stomach suddenly rumbled, and she embarrassedly explained that she was hungry. But the determined boy wanted to take the girl with him to feed her. Esfina remembered the rabbit's words that there was a village nearby, and realized that was where the boy lived. But he explained that he was living there temporarily, for his real home was elsewhere. Esfina was not very interested in these details, so she explained that she had no place to stay for the night. Then the boy guessed that Esfina might have been thrown out of the house, or had run away, and holding out his hand, offered to go with him to spend the night at his house. When they arrived at the house, the maid immediately bowed and greeted the master. Esfina looked at them from the side, and was surprised that the boy's expensive clothes did not match such a small house. She wondered why the maid had called him master. This boy was very strange in Esther's opinion, though she felt as if he had always been bullied because of his status. A short while later, Esfina was served a meal that certainly wouldn't compare to what was served in the dining hall of a knight's order. The Senok sitting across from her thanked the girl for her rescue, but she felt she had done the right thing. She doubted she should have interfered. It would be even more difficult for Senok to restrain those boys. And maybe after today they'd only bully him more. Despite the obvious signs of nervousness, Senoku explained that it didn't matter, because up until now, there had been no one who had stood up for him, and Esthina was the first and only one for him. This surprised Esther, who thought it was the servant's job to protect the Lord. But as it turned out, no one supported him when it came to learning to wield a sword. His father even threw him out. Looking at the distraught boy, Esther wondered what could have been the reason, but then she asked him what the child's name was, for he had never had a chance to introduce himself. Then the boy cheerfully told the girl that his name was Sanok Black Knight. Esfina didn't even react at first, thinking that the name sounded very familiar, but when she realized the reality of it, she jumped up from her seat, not believing what she had heard. She questioned if the boy wasn't kidding her, but when she saw his frightened face, she realized it was true. Then Esfina tried to find out if Sanok had any siblings, but as it turned out, he only had a sister. And then, looking at the child, she tried to see how this whiny boy he could become the commander-in-chief she knew so well. In the future, he would be the man everyone envied, and she thought that even as a child he was just that. It was then that Athena realized that Sanok was now learning swordsmanship while living on the estate, and the boy told her that despite his efforts, he had failed. The problem was that he was afraid of weapons. The dinner ended with Esther trying to realize that it was definitely the same Sanok in front of her. When she got back to her room, she still couldn't believe that she was back in the past and in a different body. She wanted to go back. Her mind was a mess. She also wondered if she could get her old body back. Although she realized that if she went back 18 years, there must be a real version of her somewhere. But as if hearing her thoughts, the rabbit told her not to think about it. Esfina was initially surprised by his words, but the rabbit explained that he knew what she was up to, because she must want to find the real her and change reality. So he warned her not to do that because she was forbidden to meet her real body, because they shared the same soul, and if now Esfina met her real body, then she would definitely disappear. But if she found all the deities, then the rabbit would surely grant her every wish, and Esther could wish for anything she wanted. Then, as she hugged her new friend, the girl realized that she had to do whatever she could to help herself and the deities, especially since she was in a different time in a different place, and so no one else would despise her. And even though she was with Sanok, he didn't hate her. Esfina was now completely free, which meant she could become an even more important person, and she was determined to fulfill her dream. But first she had to find the divine beings. The problem was that Esfina didn't know anything about them, so she asked the rabbit directly. He was thrilled that Esther was finally interested, and he thought she was really special, but she didn't see any weirdness in it, because she had just experienced her death today, now her birth, so she was slowly coming to her senses and had new questions. The rabbit told her that divine beings are animals like himself who have incredible power, and that with their power, they could rule a small village, an entire country, or even a dimension. Particularly dangerous creatures are found in a separate dimension, and it's the rabbit that guards these creatures in their own dimension. Humans may think they are gods, but in the dimension they are in now, their power was limited, and they cannot use it in large quantities. That's why he really needed Esfina's help, and now he needed to catch all the escaped animals before they did something stupid. But she had a new question. She realized why she couldn't date her current body, but she didn't know what she would do if she met someone she knew well in her past life. The rabbit understood her concern, but it wasn't a problem, because Esther looked completely different now. Then, reassured by the absence of any repercussions of her meeting with Sanok, Esther decided to go to bed. In the morning, she changed into the clothes she had prepared and began to question Sanok. She learned that there was a training center for knights in the village. As it turned out, the manor in which Sanok now resided belonged to the Countess of Isath, the Duke of Black Knight's fiancée. Since Sanok's father was weak-willed, the boy was sent to the estate. But here was Esfina wondering how, despite his family situation, Sanok managed to keep his title. Moreover, his character was very different from what Esther remembered. But suddenly, Sanok offered to take her to the training center with him. She agreed, as she knew she had a long way to go to catch the divine animals, and it wouldn't hurt to take a look around. When they arrived, Esfina immediately noticed the attentive and scornful glances of the other boys and those who had bullied him yesterday. Esther realized that they hated him a lot too, and it was an insanely familiar feeling to her. But when she met Pantheon and his company, they immediately ran away, even though they were initially determined to get revenge. Esthina realized that Sanok had most likely invited her, for he was afraid to come alone. But she supported him and explained that she was there for him and suggested they find somewhere more private. When they sat down on the bench, Sanok and Esfina wanted to discuss it, but Sanok gave the floor to Esfina. She asked to stay with Sanok for a while longer, since there was no place to stay in the village. She still couldn't believe that of all the people she knew, she had met the commander-in-chief. The boy happily agreed, and asked that Esfina not bother looking for another place to stay. Esfina was grateful not only for this permission, but also for the fact that Sanok did not question her about where she had come from and who she was. She also remembered that she hadn't introduced herself and finally told her name, and explained that she'd been thinking a lot about the guys who'd bullied Sanok. She realized that they would probably start bullying him again and take revenge for her beating them up. So she decided to help him, and in return for allowing Sanok, he could ask her for anything and just trust her. The boy was touched by her determination and words and couldn't hold back his tears. The frightened Esfina didn't understand why he was crying, but as it turned out, nobody had ever helped Sanoku in his life. The main character was filled with memories of the commander-in-chief. Everyone thought he was very cool, but aloof. Esfina listened to all this while on the training ground practicing her moves. But suddenly, Senok appeared at her side and praised her for her efforts and thought she was doing a good job of throwing punches. He also asked that she turn to him if she needed help, even though at this point Esfina was already consumed with hatred for the commander. But still, his words lingered in her memory for a long time. Back then, the entire Night Order was an enemy to her, except for one single friend. Seeing that Sanok continued to cry, Esfina stroked his hair and asked him to calm down. She awkwardly pulled her hands away from his face as she began to comfort the commander-in-chief in such an inappropriate manner without noticing it. Out of a desire to distract herself, Esfina began to think about also enrolling in the training center where the Sanok were trained. She lied that this desire was due to the fact that she wanted to master the art of the sword. Though the reason was that the closer Esfina was to Senokum, the easier it would be for her to defend him. She was also very curious as to why Senokum didn't get along with the sword as a child. After all, he was the future commander-in-chief of the Knightly Order. Esfina was convinced that something had influenced him. Esfina suspected that perhaps Senok was being forced to study here. He talked about how his father told him to enroll in this center and just be here. Esfina then suggested that the boy take a walk in the village. Her motivation was that she needed to collect as many divine animals as possible. But she told Senoku that she wanted to cheer him up, since he didn't have to be in the training center according to his father's terms. Especially since Esfina was also familiar with the feeling and felt that Senoku didn't need to be where there were no people dear to him. He should be with someone who will love and appreciate him, but that will happen somewhere else. Esfina didn't want to get close to Senok at first, but he helped her, so she wanted to pay him back. But just thinking about his reaction to those words in the past made her uncomfortable. But suddenly the rabbit showed up, explaining that they had an emergency, because he had sensed something not far from here, and it was most likely a divine creature. So he pointed in the necessary direction. Esfina immediately asked Senok what was in the necessary direction, and it turned out to be a village. That means that's where the first divine beast was hiding. Esfina suggested that Senok take a walk through the village with her, but he awkwardly explained that he needed to meet his teacher today. Esfina offered to go with him, but as it turned out, the teacher never met strangers because he was very famous, even from far away. But the boy wanted to ask him if he could stay away from the center for a while, and gently took the girl's hand and explained that he wanted to be near her now. But seeing her uncomprehending face, he fretted that Esfina didn't want that. And looking at this boy, Esther couldn't believe that he was her future commander. She still couldn't get her head around it all, because he didn't look like himself. But suddenly Sanok thought he was burdening Esther, so she reassured him, although she was embarrassed that she was touching him too often. Esfina reassured Sanok and then said goodbye, explaining that she wanted to take a walk in the village and suggested they meet for dinner, while Pantheon was eavesdropping on them from the bushes and had a sinister idea. At last in the village, the rabbit told Esfina the next direction of travel, but she saw nothing in that direction. This burdened her, for she had no specific information about the divine beings and didn't know how to spot them. The rabbit explained that in the place where a divine creature appeared, one could feel the flow of its power. But people used to call such a phenomenon some kind of miracle. Then suddenly snowflakes began to fall on the girl's hands. She had a very strange sensation and suspected that this was the divine power. The villagers looking at the snow didn't seem at all surprised, as if it was a familiar sight to them. And then Esfina approached the man and asked him what was going on. He immediately realized from her question that the girl was not from around here and told her that it had been snowing a lot in the village lately. Even the capital's magicians came here to make sure that it was not a rumor. However, they didn't notice anything strange. And although it was unusual, the snow was not dangerous, so they just enjoyed this natural phenomenon. The man also offered Esfina to taste a snowflake. The suggestion surprised her, for snow was water and it had no taste at all. However, this snow had a taste. It was slightly sweet. Local children loved this phenomenon, and since the snow was not dangerous, there was nothing wrong with it. It was then that the rabbit realized it was none other than the Snow Weaver, a divine creature who makes snow, and depending on his mood, the snow will be different. but he would be very difficult for the rabbit to deal with. Weaver's specialty was that if he was in a good mood, the snow would taste sweet. When he was in a bad mood, it would taste salty. And when he's angry, it tastes spicy. But this deity didn't like Rabbit very much, and that made Esther worried. But she had no choice. She had to catch it. Esfina already understood from the rabbit story what this deity was like. But she wanted to set a trap, so she started asking what he liked because he might have some favorite food or something. As it turned out, there were indeed divine animals that liked human food, but the rabbit didn't know what Snow Weaver liked. But suddenly the rabbit sensed the vague presence of a deity and pointed in the right direction to an alley. But Esfina didn't want to go there, explaining that she didn't like the darkness. This darkness reminded her a lot of how she had been victimized by the fire. But she had no choice but to go to the alley, where she saw a scary picture. There was a child surrounded by two men who were extorting money from him. The child begged to be pitied, but then he quickly overpowered them with his snow magic. The two men immediately grabbed the first objects they could get their hands on to attack. But Esfina, who tripped them, warned them to watch their step, even when fighting, because the enemy could knock them down and then they couldn't do anything. The boy thanked Esfina for his rescue, but she decided to save the greeting for later and asked her to introduce him. His name was Cade and he was a mage. The girl's eyes widened at the news. For the place she worked was a place for knights and mages alike, and among Esther's many detractors was also a wizard. But with the exception of the mages who joined the Celestial Knight Order, most of the wizards lived in the magic tower. While Esthina was thinking about this, the boy quickly approached and began to scrutinize her. He hoped that Esther hadn't gotten hurt in his magical blast. She explained that she was fine and had never seen the wizard before and was confused. Obviously, this was a lie, but she couldn't think of anything else. So the boy started asking Esther where she lived and what her name was. After she gave hers, Cade reintroduced himself. He was very pleased to meet Esther. But what confused her was that this child's name seemed very familiar, and it felt like she had heard it somewhere before. Esfina also noticed that Cade was too young to be a wizard, but he thought that Esfina was too young to be so handy with a normal branch. She smiled and explained that she was trained in swordsmanship, and began to ask Cade where he lived. He wasn't from around here and followed his teacher, a great mage. And then the shocked girl finally remembered who she'd met. Kadam Rakun was the name of the great hermit wizard. When Esther became vice captain, the emperor was stricken with an unknown disease. The only thing that could cure the ruler was the magic of the great wizard. The great wizard Cade appeared in the empire, healed the emperor, and then disappeared. The emperor thankfully ordered his knights to find the grand wizard, but he disappeared without a trace. Esfina remembered how hard they worked to find the wizard, and it bothered her that she didn't remember his name right away. She was also impressed that this little boy would become such a great man in the future, and she even wanted to be friends with him. While Cade was scavenging, he told her that he and his teacher had come to collect some treasure, and they'd heard that some strange things had happened in the village. He also told about their treasures. For example, a harp that makes waves. They also have stones that make food very tasty if you put them in the food. And the last thing is a time clock that can be used to travel into the future. And the last thing the girl was very interested in. But while she stood there shocked, Cade continued to tell her about himself and his teacher. Suddenly, a frightened rabbit signaled for Esther to get ready, and so she covered the young wizard with her own when the snowy weaver appeared. But as it turned out, he wasn't intimidating and looked like a small child, and at first she couldn't even believe he was a divine creature. Esfina was worried that her rabbit looked like a beast, but this divine creature was in human form. She suspected they were from different species, but suddenly the panicked boy started running away, and Esfina and her rabbit rushed after him. Cade didn't understand such a spontaneous escape, and then she had to explain herself and come up with some excuse, but she suggested to Cade that they should meet again, for they would still be in the village, and she wanted to ask him about his treasure. For a while, the boy stared excitedly at the strange girl, and then he wondered about the divine being she had seen. He was also concerned that this girl was always running around with some strange animal on her head. So he decided to follow her. Even though Esfina tried her best to catch up with the snow wyvern, she still lost sight of him. But at least he was definitely in the village, so she had to catch him. As it turned out, at this time the mad boy was behind Esfina's back. Meanwhile, at the training center, the Pantheon decided to resort to violence again. This time, they even threw Sanoku the sword and gave him a chance to try and fend off their attack. Although Pantheon already knew he wouldn't succeed, because the idiot who beat him up wasn't around. So now Pantheon would take revenge and break the guy's legs. Obviously, Sanoku was very scared, and he realized that Pantheon was not joking and would really do something like that to him. But suddenly he remembered the words of Esfina, who explained that he should always fight back. Because of these words, the boy resolutely grabbed his weapon and was no longer in the mood to simply tolerate the bullying. Such insolence made Pantheon laugh. He realized that Sanok could not do anything to him. So, pointing his sword at his neck, he suggested that Sanok take a chance and try to hurt him. In spite of his fear, Sanok got up and got into a fighting stance, but Pantheon and his friends just continued to mock and laugh at him, after which they easily knocked his weapon out of his hands and threw him away. They continued to beat and abuse him. Sanok remembered how he was on his knees choking with nausea. The man next to him was talking about what a remarkable talent he had, for he alone could withstand such trials. But he was upset that this remarkable child could not even pick up a sword. His father, watching him suffer, only scornfully continued to call him names. To the laughter of his opponents, Sanok began to reach for his sword. Then he stood up and ran up with a sharp horizontal slashing attack, cutting through Pantheon's clothes. Pantheon didn't realize what had just happened to him, but it was as if Sanoka had been overcome by a compulsion. He looked fiercely at his opponent, not about to back down. Pantheon was frightened, for before Sanok could not even draw his sword. But now Pantheon was sure that this guy could kill him, and all he needed was his will. But suddenly, instead of attacking, Sanok lost consciousness. Pantheon immediately calmed down and ordered his guys to deal with Sanok. In the meantime, Esfina continued to run around the village in order to track down the divine creature. The rabbit couldn't sense it either, as the snow wyvern was hiding from him because of their mutually dislike. When asked how did this happen, the rabbit remembered their constant quarrels and cries of hatred. But to the girl, he did not explain this, and simply explained that she did not know the reason for such a dislike. His lie was too obvious, and Esfina clearly didn't like it, so she grabbed the rabbit and resented how much he didn't care about her life at all. After all, if she didn't find all the divine beings, she wouldn't get her own body. After calming down, she began to ponder how to proceed. At the very least, the boy was in the village and all she had to do was find him and catch him. She found another branch on the ground, though it was too small and weak for her to fight. Esfina was eager to find her real weapon. She especially wanted the sword she wielded in her previous life back. But with her current body, it was unlikely she could even lift such a weapon. Finally, frustrated, Esfina decided to return home, where Sanok was waiting for her. But when she arrived at the training ground, she found Sanok lying unconscious. She tried to bring the boys to their senses and find out what had happened to him. Then she saw the boys running away, and they ran away as soon as they saw her. Esfina was furious and wanted to go to them to deal with them, but Sanok stopped her by gently taking her by the hem of her clothes. He tearfully confessed that he really wanted to become stronger and as strong as Esfina was. Shocked by these words, the girl didn't know how to respond to these words. She knew that this guy would already be the strongest knight and would be considered the greatest man in history. He would be the worst nightmare for his enemies, but she wondered where he got such talent from. From what she could see as a child, the talent was absent, though it was unlikely that talent could just take off in this kid. So surely his skills were somewhere inside his body. But Sanok hadn't unlocked his talent yet. Esther wondered for a while whether she should help Sanok, but she decided to find out what his purpose was. Estefina suspected he wanted revenge on the Pantheon and his friends, and Sanok was upset, realizing his true intentions did not please Esther. But to his surprise, she promised to help. Sanok would become strong anyway, even if she didn't intervene. But it was still hard for Esthina to see the commander from the future and the little boy in front of her as one person. So she thought of them as different people, and that's why she wanted to help him so much. Besides, Esfina and the commander-in-chief had never had anything to do with each other except her dislike. As it turned out, the day Esthina won, she had brought her application for expulsion. But Sanok slapped the table and ordered her to find the girl quickly and bring her to him. He wanted to see Lady Esthina, a knight of the celestial knighthood, for he had not given her permission to leave, and he knew she had nowhere else to go. So he demanded that she be returned to him as soon as possible. Esther told him that she was helping him out of gratitude. For when they first met, the girl had no food, no home, no clothes. But Sanok took her in and gave her food and a home, so she'll thank him and help her become stronger. But he doesn't have to go to a training center, because Sanok will be trained by her. But in return, Esfina asked that Sanok help her with her search, but she will tell him more about it later at dinner. Esfina told him that she was looking for a child, which surprised the boy. His surprised face made Esfina a little embarrassed, as she thought Sanok was very cute. When she calmed down, she described a child with white curly hair, wearing shorts and small horns. While Esfina described him, Sanok drew something, making a portrait of the man. This drawing, in spite of its quality, seemed very funny to Esther. But Estefina suggested that Sanoku should not draw anymore, because he would be the best knight in the future, not an artist. But afterward, she asked why Sanok lived in that house alone, because if his father had left him all his possessions, he could have moved to the manor, as it turned out to be very cold and unbearable in that place. But then the boy was shy and thought his fears were silly, so he shut up. But the determined girl explained to him that he could talk about all his worries without shame, because she would soon disappear from his life anyway. The initially shocked boy was very sad to hear these words, but he decided to confide in her and told her that he was also bullied at the estate, and he wondered how long he would have to live with being so weak, and how long he would have to endure all that abuse. Every day he was told that he would grow up to be useless. That's when Esther realized he wanted revenge on more than just the idiots who beat him up, and if she helps him now, he won't feel grateful to the real Estefina. However, Sanok had sheltered her, fed her, and she wanted to pay for it. Seeing his upset face, Esthina suggested that they not talk about such sad things anymore, and instead eat well and have fun. Sanok thought they should do a workout, but instead Esfina suggested that they not do it. After all, he wouldn't become the strongest in just one day of training, and the same philosophy applied to rest. Nothing would change if he took one day of good rest and dedicated that day to himself. So smiling, she wanted to have fun with the boy, much to his embarrassment. At this time, a mad and disgruntled snow beast was screaming, cursing Rafus the rabbit. He also didn't understand why Rafus was with that man, but he wasn't going to let it go. Esfina's morning seemed like it should start out quietly, but suddenly she heard the sound of shattering glass and went down to the first floor. To her surprise, she saw a shocked maid who had dropped her tray. She pointed to the window and asked Esfina to come over. And then the shocked girl saw that all the streets around were covered with mountains of snow. She and Sanok immediately got dressed and ran outside and realized that the snow was real. The locals also didn't understand what had happened and marveled at the fact that the village had turned into snow piles overnight. Their lord had already raised the alarm, so magicians were to arrive to deal with this snow. Sitting down to the pile of snow, Esfina remembered the words of Rafus, who told about the peculiarities of snow created by Weaver, and that the taste of snow depends on the mood. When the mood is good, snow is sweet. When it's bad, it's salty. And when the snow is sharp, it means that Snow Weaver is mad. And now the snow was sharp, bitter, and sour at the same time. The rabbit was surprised that the snow tasted like that, because Snow Weaver wasn't usually the type to get angry that often. As it turned out, the sour taste meant that Snow Weaver was very sad right now. Esthina couldn't understand what it had to do with, but Rafus thought Snow Weaver was very cranky. But even that explanation didn't help the girl. She summoned Sanok to her side and explained that they needed to move on. But Esfina, who was in a hurry, began to slip and fell and warned Sanok of the danger. But he ran up at the last moment, hugging the girl tightly and saving her from falling. She was amazed at his strength. But after realizing their proximity, the boy immediately let go of Estefina in embarrassment and moved away to a useless distance. Despite the boy's embarrassment, Esfina was more interested in his physical abilities. She suspected that he had been well developed as a child, which was why he had become so strong in the future, and that he had difficulty only in wielding the sword itself. When she looked around, she saw the worried villagers realizing that their crops were ruined. People wouldn't be able to eat frozen food. Besides, they would soon begin to spoil. Esfina was upset that the Snow Weaver had done so much damage to the surrounding area. For the villagers who lived off trade, the snow was very dangerous. She didn't believe the divine beast was capable of this, and now she had to stop it. Calling Raphius closer to her, Esthina asked to make him visible to other people. She wanted Sanok to finally see the rabbit. After all, she was embarrassed that she looked like a person talking to herself. Especially in the future, she was also going to take Sanok on a quest. But Raphius started to argue, explaining that he didn't want to do that. But eventually, Esfina quickly changed his mind, so he agreed and began to use his magic. Sanok immediately noticed him and gently started stroking Rafus until the rabbit bit him. That's when Athena told Sanok that the child they were looking for was what the rabbit needed. But suddenly Rafus told Sanoku that he was obsessed with too many things, though he was probably too young to fully realize his obsession, which was even better. Since Athena had decided to take Sanok with her in the future, she told him that Rafus was a divine creature, just like the boy they were looking for. After some time of her detailed explanations, Sanok finally understood everything and fully believed the girl's words without once doubting them. Athena, though she was pleased, was surprised that Sanok didn't have any doubts, though it sounded strange. And looking at him, she hoped that he would be okay in the future, no matter what he learned. When he grew up, that knowledge might affect his personality too much. She remembered that disgruntled boy again and tried to figure out how he would change in the future after they met. Watching the children talking, Rafus marveled at how much strangeness there was in that boy. And looking at the happy Athena, he suspected that the girl had no idea of Sanok's true character. Though seeing her happiness, he preferred not to interfere with further developments, for ignorance could sometimes be a good thing. They began to question the locals, but no one had seen the boy with white hair. Athena realized it would be problematic to search further for Snowweaver this way, but suddenly they heard a scream. A man was complaining about falling over because of some boy with white hair and ears. Sanoka and Athena looked over and realized it was the Snowweaver they were looking for. So they came closer to the old man and asked him where he had seen the boy. As it turned out, standing on the roof of one of the houses, the Snowweaver was carefully watching the children playing with snow. A little girl and her mother were making a snowman and realized that the snowman looked a lot like their daddy. But Snowy Weaver was not happy about this. He remembered Raphaeus and became furious. He had no parents, so he couldn't look at other people's happiness. He aimed the ice shards at the child, and the shards were sharp enough to kill the girl instantly. But at the last moment, Athena intervened and managed to save them by flying away from the point of impact. Then she put them all on the ground and sent them home. Athena always had a rabbit by her side that Snowweaver could see, and when it got angry, it decided to attack Esther. All she had to do was fight back with her wand, but she wasn't sure if she'd be able to utilize her full swordsmanship potential with a weapon like that. Suddenly, an attack was headed towards Sanoku, but Athena was able to defend him in time. Though after such a strong attack, her wand, which had completely frozen under the influence of magic, crumbled. Noticing this, Sanok immediately pointed to the nearest weapons counter, where she saw the sword. And just as Athena had time to grab it, she was already under attack. But she was able to deal with this attack as well, shattering absolutely all of the ice cubes. Refuse was very happy about this, for he thought he had definitely chosen the best person for his purpose. But the frightened lamb didn't understand why this human child was so strong. When he tried to run away again, his path was blocked by Sanok, not allowing him to pass. The Snowweaver realized that the boy in front of him was no obstacle and was about to attack. But then Athena told Sanok to use a barrel. He immediately took the barrel and threw it at the boy, blinding him for a while. As he stood there trying to regain consciousness, Athena flew towards him to knock him down. As soon as she attacked Snowweaver, he immediately took on his more familiar appearance and was already more like Rufus. In addition, as soon as Snowweaver lost consciousness, the snow stopped coming and began to melt. Sanoka and Athena tied Snowweaver up and watched him waiting for him to wake up. But just as he came to his senses, Snowweaver began to scream, not realizing who was now in front of him and why they were so strong. Athena was more interested in why the Snowweaver had changed his appearance so drastically, as he had recently been a human. As it turns out, when a divine creature is shocked, they revert to their true form. Athena wondered why the rabbit always looked like a muffin, and the conflict between the two began again. Snowweaver, who was watching this, was very angry, and suddenly it started snowing again. There was a lot of it, and it started to cover all the streets around. Rafus tried to reason with Snowweaver, explaining that if he used too much power, he might disappear. But the freed Snowweaver started yelling at Rafus, explaining that he shouldn't care. He then used his powers to summon an ice flake, which scratched Athena's face. Blood began to drip from the wound. This immediately enraged Sanok, so he began to approach the Snowy Weaver. The frightened boy immediately ran to get away from the two and pushed Athena out of the way and fled into the village. Despite her fall, Athena was more worried about Sanok's condition and feared that Snowweaver might have hurt him. The Snowweaver did hit Sanok, but he fell landing right above the girl. Sanok was insanely embarrassed, But Esfina smiled as she realized that the weaver had once again escaped them, and now they would have to catch him again, though she seemed to be taking it in good fun. She then stroked Sanok's head and thanked him for helping her in her search for Snow Weaver. But suddenly, after helping the girl up, he got down on one knee before her, whereupon he gently adjusted her outfit. He asked if it was completely useless to her. There was a look of excitement in his eyes, but the initially worried girl smiled happily and explained to Sanokam that he was wrong. After all, in her opinion, he had done a good job. The longer Esfina looked at that crying and perpetually agitated boy, the more the image of the commander-in-chief faded from her mind, and she thought it was right, for now it was her friend Sanok, whom she had met here. As Rafis watched them, he realized that Esfina would regret her decision. She didn't know about the boy's obsessions yet, and when she did, it would probably be too late. It had been a week. The whole village was still completely engulfed in snow. Besides, the snow was getting heavier every day, and the culprit of all that had happened after his escape was never seen again. Esfina was worried that Snow Weaver had decided to hide somewhere, because then it would be harder to find him. But she was pleased that despite the change in climate, the locals had adapted. But not everyone was the same. The villagers started cursing at the mages who came to them and couldn't figure out the problem. They wanted the snow to finally stop. Esfina realized that if the royal mages really came to the village, the situation would become much more serious. They would never forgive those who harmed civilians. So she turned to Rafis and asked him to tell her why Snow Weaver was behaving the way he was. She thought he knew exactly the answer, but he kept denying it and saying he had no idea. Esfina was clearly disturbed by his behavior and didn't understand what it was about. She was also angry that this divine beast, who looked more like some kind of dumpling, was acting very arrogant. But suddenly it started talking and told her that divine beasts have no concept of family. But even so, Snow Weaver really wanted to be like a human for the sake of having a family. And to do that, he got himself a human form. But Esfina still didn't understand why Snow Weaver hated Raphaeus so much. As it turned out, he had once decided to take Snow Weaver in and make him his ward. Esfina thought that was when Rafis became like a parent to this boy, but he had a completely different opinion. He also had absolutely no understanding of what it meant to be a parent, and therefore did not consider himself one. Esther realized how difficult their destiny was, but she explained to Raphaeus that when the king's knights arrived, they would capture Snowy Weaver for sure, and she didn't know how this world could accept divine beings. Snow Weaver could be experimented on or killed immediately upon capture. So as she looked at Raphaeus, she wondered how he would feel if what she'd told him came true. But looking at his face, she couldn't understand what he was really thinking. So she explained that it was time for them to go back. When they got back to the square, she saw Sanok sitting there and was amazed at how long he had been waiting for her there. The guys decided to split up in order to find the divine animal and save time, but both of them found nothing. Sanok was very frustrated with his failure. Esfina calmed him down, explaining that he did a good job. But suddenly she noticed that he had a sword in his hand. She remembered his predicament, so she turned her attention to the weapon. The girl promised that it wouldn't be long before Sanok would adjust to it, and suggested that they start practicing. Looking at his joyful face, Esfina realized that the boy was very cute, and she couldn't think of him otherwise despite his future. So she stroked his head and offered to finally start training. While she turned away and looked for a suitable place, the boy touched his hair in the place where Esfina stroked it. But suddenly the woman started talking about a child she had seen in an alley. So Sanok and Esfina immediately rushed to run there. And as soon as they saw the boy with his back to them, they rushed to him. Esfina drew her sword and started to attack. But at the last moment, Cade managed to put up a defense of magic. She realized that if she continued on the same trajectory, she would hit Sanok, who was trying to catch her. She realized that if she continued on the same trajectory, she would hit Sanok, who was trying to catch her. Immediately upon descending, Esfina guiltily began apologizing to Cade for confusing him with another person. But Cade awkwardly explained to her that he was fine and she didn't hurt him. But nevertheless, Esfina kept apologizing. But Cade was wondering how come Esfina was running around on the street and suddenly attacking people. That's when she awkwardly revealed that they were looking for someone, and she had confused him with another person. She said she was looking for a boy about the same age. So from the back, he and Cade looked alike. Cade realized it was possible to get confused in the alleys, so he didn't take offense. Esfina told him about him, and explained that he had been a great help to her in finding the right person. Esfina immediately explained to Cade that her friend was a bit shy and asked that he not worry in case anything happened. But Cade, staring at the boy, didn't understand where Esfina saw any shyness at all, for rather his gaze was murderous. But still calming down, Cade explained to Esther that he could help her find that boy. Esfina knew that in the future, she would do well to have such a strong ally as Cade. She couldn't take his help, however, and thanked him for the offer and wanted to decline, explaining that if she started to tell him anything, he might have a lot of questions. She finally decided to tell Cade, but asked him to keep it a secret before elaborating, and asked for his help if it wouldn't bother him. After some thought, Cade promised he wouldn't tell anyone about anything. She asked Cade if he knew anything about divine animals. Cade had indeed heard from his teacher that they were creatures that came from another dimension. His teacher also told him that the world is divided into several dimensions, and they intertwine with each other in complex ways. And sometimes creatures emerge from the intersection, and also sometimes it happens that people travel through time. A frightened Esfina realized that she obviously couldn't let on that she was a time traveler, so she played up her surprise to the best of her ability. But what surprised Cade was that Esther knew something about divine beings, something even many mages don't know about. Esfina wanted to explain why she knew about them, but suddenly she heard the shouting of people trying to catch the suspect. When they traveled closer to the place of the scream, they saw knights running after someone. Esfina was worried that the knights guessed the culprit of the snowfall was Snowweaver, most likely because he had scared people and had been reported. So Esfina suggested that the boys follow these knights, for perhaps they would find someone. Sanok noticed that the knights had split off in different directions. So Esfina thought for a moment and suggested they split up. Cade wanted to go alone, for if he didn't find anyone, he could fly to the others right away. And in order to track them, he put a tracking spell on them. In case they found Snowweaver, they would send a signal. But he asked Esfina to tell him what the kids' characteristics were, and she explained that they needed a baby with horns. After a moment's thought, Cade promised to send a signal with firecrackers if he found Snowweaver, and that was the end of it. The knights had by now lost their suspect and were immediately embarrassed. After all, this child looked strange and ran away. Esfina, who had overheard this conversation, calmed down, but Sanok didn't understand what they should do next. Esfina was convinced that the knights were looking for Snowy Weaver, which meant that he was not far away, and it would be good if Rafus tried to sense Snowy Weaver's presence. But the lamb was hiding from the rabbit. At this time, Snowweaver, hiding in a dead end, realized that he had used too much power and couldn't get rid of his own tracks. But suddenly Esfina came up to him and scared him to death. She smiled at her finder and offered to part ways peacefully. The obviously frightened Snowweaver immediately tried to run away, but Esfina was amused. She smiled, and in one easy movement was ahead of the boy and explained that he would not be able to hide from her. The frightened Snowweaver realized that he should definitely not get caught by this girl. So out of the remnants of magic, he created a huge ice floe. Looking at this ice floe, Esfina realized that if it fell now, the other people would notice it, and then the knights would surely come here to investigate the situation, and they would capture Snowweaver. Weaver threatened Esfina that if she didn't let him go, he would kill her. The girl realized she had no other choice, so she had to silently eliminate Snowweaver, and she had only one chance. She immediately drew her weapon and began to attack the ice floe. When the terrified Snowweaver was distracted, Esther seized the moment and grabbed him and flipped him over, throwing him to the ground. It was obvious by his reaction that Weaver was very angry. He threatened that he would not tolerate her anymore and would definitely destroy her. Esfina could not understand why Snowweaver had such a strong hatred for her. After all, she had done nothing to him. But their conversation was interrupted by Sanok announcing that all the knights were already moving in that direction. But then, flying above them, announced Cade, who offered to help Esfina and Sanok. She shouted to Cade, asking him to save them as soon as possible. And finally, he snapped his fingers and they disappeared. Just as the knights arrived, they found no one, though they were convinced they heard noises coming from this street. At that moment, Cade hid everyone behind his barrier, and smiling explained to Esfina that he thought it was the best solution because she wanted them to be undetected. Esther realized that the people outside wouldn't hear them, and after making sure of that, she activated her sword magic to use her power to its fullest on Weaver. Cade, watching her, was amazed that such a young girl was already a master swordsman, which was not typical for her age. He even speculated that she might be a swordsmanship genius. Esfina's plan was successful. She tied the boy up, placing him against the wall and preventing him from escaping. Surprisingly, right after the battle, Esfina started to feel much better. The battle was like a full-body workout for her. Afterward, she made sure from Sanok that he wasn't injured. Watching from the sidelines, Cade thought it was strange that Esfina was able to catch the overly active divine beast so easily. Cade remembered how they had caught it. Suddenly, Sanok came over and looked at the canopy that was nearby and explained to Cade that if they used it, they could subdue this lamb. He asked Cade for help because he felt like only Cade could get up there. As soon as he was there, Sanok immediately cut the sticks that held up the canopy, and he fell right on top of Snowweaver. Esfina came up to him and happily explained that it was now over for him. Sanoku still couldn't believe he was able to make such a good hit. Before, he had thought sword wielders were very cruel and callous. But thanks to Esther, he realized that swordsmanship could be truly beautiful. He wanted to be like her, so when she approached him, he happily explained that he was able to make his first good sword stroke only because of her help. He wasn't scared at all, so he thought Esfina was the best. She immediately remembered the words of her commander, who also praised her and thought that she could be proud of herself. At that time, he had affectionately called her his only deputy. Esfina didn't understand why the memories she had forgotten were coming back again. At this time, Cade suggested that the friends leave as soon as possible, for the knights would soon be here. As they led Weaver away with them, the boy continued to scream, not wanting to talk to people. He wished everyone dead. Esfina, who was tired of his screams, asked Sanok to prepare everything necessary. That's when he pulled out the prepared tickling feather and started tickling Weaver. While Sanok was doing the deed, Esfina began to think about her next steps. She was asked to gather the divine animals, but no one said she would have to hold any hostage. But if the lamb escaped, she'd be in trouble. And Rafus never said what to do with him, so she warned Rafus that she couldn't catch Weaver again if he escaped. Something had to be done about him, especially since the residents were already expecting the royal knights, and Weaver's life would be in danger if he escaped again. So she asked that Rafus be sincere with her in the future so they could work something out. And despite his disinterest earlier, the rabbit agreed. When she returned to Weaver, the boy was screaming, authorizing himself to be killed. Esfina listened and decided to get Rafus's opinion. She wondered if he would agree to kill the lamb. But suddenly a determined Rafus forbade Esther to kill Weaver. Weaver was astonished, for he had not expected such an answer from Rafus. A surprised Weaver asked the rabbit why he had done that, but as it turned out, Rafus had never hated Weaver. After a moment's thought, Esther offered to give Weaver to the king's knights if he ran away. But Rafus explained that Weaver had to come home alive. Weaver was disturbed by Rufus's words because it looked like he was worried about him. Seeing his emotions, Esfina explained to the boy that he seemed to care for him sincerely. Weaver, crying with happiness, took his other form and threw himself into the girl's arms. A frightened Esfina didn't realize what was happening, but tried to comfort the crying creature. Cade congratulated everyone on the reconciliation, but wanted to talk to Rafus alone. So a week had passed since Weaver's capture. It wasn't snowing anymore, the weather had all recovered, and it was getting nice. Also, Esther finally began training Sanok. Since Sanok was afraid of guns, the training started with getting him used to them. Each time, Sanok was exhausted, although it seemed like nothing much was being done. But overcoming fears was harder than it seemed. Weaver was also supportive of Sanok and thought the protagonist was a great teacher. Weaver was now living with them. Sanok's maid received Weaver quite strangely. She was very happy that the master had a new friend. Esfina was still remembering her strange conversation with Cade when she had to tell him that catching Weaver was Rafus's request. He also knew that Esfina didn't have a home and offered her a place in his dormitory, because if they were close, he would help her catch the rest of the divine animals. And Cade's teacher was also willing to help the girl. She wanted to accept, but Sanok showed up and refused. He asked that Esther stay with him. Crying, he hoped that Esther wouldn't leave him after all. Embarrassed by his influence, Esfina refused Cade's request. She justified it by saying she only wanted to teach Sanok how to play ball. But she was even more interested in where the next divine beast was. At this time, the divine beast was standing near the city walls, and she smelled Weaver. The next day, Cade came to tell of the arrival of mages from the Heavenly Knight Order to investigate the snowfall incident. Cade tried to reassure Athena, explaining that they wouldn't find anything and would soon leave on their own. An overjoyed weaver, who was the perpetrator of the incident, promised to stand up for Athena if anyone hurt her. The only thing that made Athena happy was that she could get information about the other divine animals from Weaver. But as it turned out, he didn't know anything either. As it turned out, when he first woke up in this world, there were only 3 deities. One of them ran away wanting to see lightning. The other one wanted to find flowers. And Weaver was the only one left who lived in the city. This really made the search very difficult for Athena, and she didn't know where to look for the next animals.